and welcome to this politics topic video from Tutor to You, looking at constitutional changes under the new Labour government from 1997 onwards. In this particular video, we'll be taking a closer look at reform of the House of Lords. But before we do so, we'll be taking a very quick look at exactly how we might change the constitution in the UK and why we might want to change it in the first place. So in terms of how the UK constitution is changed, as you can see from the screen in front of you, any of the sources of the UK constitution can be changed. Previous topic videos looking at the sources of the UK constitution might be a good place to head if you're not quite sure what those might be. There can be acts of parliament, for example the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, or the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the Human Rights Act. All kinds of acts of parliament. Statute law can be changed as a very often quick way of changing the UK constitution. The top left there points out that the constitution might change as a result of referendum results. Good examples there would be the results of the 2016 EU referendum, in which the majority of Britons voted for Brexit. Other examples might include the devolution referendums held in Scotland and Wales shortly after the Labour government took power in 1997. In both cases, the referendum results provided public support and effectively a mandate for the government, in the case of devolution, to go ahead and pass acts of parliament that would effectively put into statute law the changes desired by the people in the referendum. Other possible ways of changing will be via new or amended international treaties, perhaps the result of a commission or an investigation leading to recommendations for how the government might work, possibly the result of petitions from the people to the government, perhaps to initiate a change or at least investigate the feasibility of a change. We could also see action by select committees. Now, a select committee is a committee usually consisting of members of the House of Commons, although certainly members of the House of Lords, peers, could sit on a select committee, and their role is to scrutinise the work of specific government departments. So, for example, you could have the Treasury Select Committee or the Health Select Committee, and those select committees scrutinise the work of the government and may suggest changes. Clearly, there could also be changes to conventions. New customs and habits might change. So, for example, changing the frequency and length of Prime Minister's question time, which is something that Tony Blair did when he became Prime Minister, changing it from twice a week to once a week, Wednesday lunchtime for half an hour. So why might we want to change the Constitution? There are many reasons. Just a small number are outlined here for you. Possibly culture is changing. Society's pressures and expectations might be changing. The public might particularly want a change. For example, it could be pressure by people with a more nationalistic tendency to seek devolution. Or in the case of the Brexit referendum, clearly some dissatisfaction with the status quo and the impact that the European Union was having on the UK. It may be that there is actually a lack of clarity in current constitutional arrangements, so changes might be made to clarify those. It could be that unwanted behaviour is being tackled, so for example declarations of donations to political parties following perhaps scandalous donations might be a prompt for constitutional change. Possibly there could be a changing world order, additional threats. So certainly the events of 9/11 and terrorism attacks from 2001 onwards led to acts such as the Civil Contingencies Act, which allowed the British government to effectively override virtually any law in the UK apart from the Civil Contingencies Act and the Human Rights Act in order to manage the country in an emergency. It could also be for retaining parliamentary sovereignty and some degree of control. Um, More broadly, and perhaps also more specifically, there are a number of other reasons suggested here for you. A number of commentators have suggested that there are now too many unelected and powerful quangos. That's a quasi-autonomous non-government organisation. And these are government-funded bodies but without a specific minister in charge. So potentially these people who are unelected could be regarded as having too much executive power. That could be a reason for changing the UK constitution. There has been certainly a perceived loss of parliamentary sovereignty, hence the Brexit referendum and the shifting back to Westminster of sovereignty away from the European Union. Potentially pressure for electoral reform, pressure of the third parties or minor parties, for example, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. The first past the post electoral system used in Britain for the general elections makes it very, very hard for small parties to win seats, even though they may actually, in terms of the popular vote, have a significant share of the vote. Other prompts might be in response to scandals, for example, the well-documented cash for honours, cash for peerages campaigns. It could be due to vote winning or advancing political careers. So, for example, Tony Blair was often regarded as seeking advancement in his own political career by winning the hearts and minds of people. So, for example, again, going back to devolution, we could consider the fact that he included devolution on the 1997 winning manifesto as a way to increase support for the Labour Party, particularly in Scottish constituencies, and help to protect or defend Labour against the advance of the Scottish National Party. So those are some of the key reasons why the UK constitution might be changed. So why did Labour make so many changes from 1997 to 2010? And there really were a significant number of constitutional changes in that period. Now the key is that many of these were actually on Labour's winning 1997 manifesto. So they did have a mandate to push through these changes. Examples, as we've already mentioned, include the Human Rights Act and devolution. Again, we've already mentioned that perhaps Tony Blair arguably was vote seeking, looking to advance the prospects of the Labour Party and his own career, particularly in Scotland, by appealing to Scottish constituencies in terms of being able to promise them devolution and more power. It could arguably also be just a general response to the public wanting change after having a Conservative government since 1979. Many of these changes were also desired by the Labour leader prior to Tony Blair, John Smith, who died in office. Effectively, it was a sign of respect to him, but a way of bridging the gap between old Labour and new Labour, so political manoeuvring in terms of internal party politics. And you could also argue that it is a sort of a testament to the more radical approach that New Labour wanted to deploy, as we might call it, third way socialism. Potentially lots of the devolution changes and other constitutional changes were sort of radicalism on the cheap. Nothing major really changed, but they were seen as making changes. And that takes us neatly on to looking at House of Lords reform. It's worth taking a few minutes and perhaps even just pausing the video here to read very carefully through those 3 bullet points relating to the 1997 manifesto pledges. Effectively, the Labour Party campaigned on a platform of removing all hereditary peers from the House of Lords, reviewing the appointment of live peers and making the essentially the makeup of the House of Lords far more representative of the population as a whole, and actually looking at even deeper change in the Lords. So what actually ended up happening? Well, the House of Lords Act 1999 was pushed through quite quickly in the end. It was a fairly quick response as Labour had significant power and were definitely riding the high after their landslide 1997 victory. Now, that act did not go all the way. They did not remove all hereditary peers from the House of Lords, which at the time effectively was a compromise. They abolished all but 92 of those hereditary peers, but this was initially intended just as a temporary measure in order to ensure some continuity before removing all of those hereditary peers. As it says there at the bottom, that second wave of promised reform, removal of all hereditary peers, never materialised. And as we work through this topic video, we'll explore some of the reasons why that might be the case. Following the House of Lords Act 1999, the Wakeham Commission was set up in order to produce a deeper and broader plan for reform of the House of Lords. We'll take a look at that in a second, but it's worth noting at this point that despite the proposal, despite the commission, and this is true of a number of commissions set up by New Labour, the Labour government very rarely acted on them. This is certainly true in the case of Lords reform. So here's what the Wakeham Report ended up recommending. They said that there should be 550 members of the House of Lords and came up with specific numbers or proportions of that number who should be elected in elections by the general public rather than appointed by a appointments commission. There should also, for the remaining peers of those who wouldn't be elected, there should be an independent appointments commission. In effect, that would take away some of the politicisation of possible appointments, avoid favours being distributed, and trying to prevent the influence of political parties on the makeup of the House of Lords. Both of those factors should then mean that the Lords would be much more broadly representative of British society. Following the issue of this report, all major parties ahead of the May 2001 general election included quite detailed statements on further reform to the House of Lords. Following the re-election of Labour, they published a white paper. Now, a white paper is a report or guide from the government that provides information relating to a key topic, in this case, Lords reform, and also providing proposals and making recommendations. And effectively, it's a sort of proposal for future legislation. It's a way for the government to sound out possible options and reactions to its policy before it actually introduces those as a bill into the Commons. The 2001 white paper there, you can see in that green box at the top, pointed out that having a second chamber, a bicameral parliament, was really important to the health of Britain's democracy. There was certainly no discussion at this point of abolition of the House of Lords. And that's certainly something that has continued, that view has continued. The Labour Party really felt post House of Lords Act 1999 that whilst there had been reforms, they still could go further. And that white paper definitely tried to outline proposals for recommendations. There were distinct dissimilarities, though, between the Labour white paper and the Wakeham Report. Different numbers of members, a greater emphasis on election rather than appointment, and other issues in the Wakeham Report just either glossed over or outright refused. So, following that white paper, what happened? Well, the answer is not very much. We need to skip forward a couple of years now to 2003, when a vote was taken in Parliament in both the Lords and the Commons following a 2-day debate on whether there should be appointment of peers, election of peers, or, as was debated and voted on in the House of Commons separately, whether the Lords themselves should actually be abolished. Now, I'm not going to run through all of the statistics on the votes there for you. It's quite clear that the Lords and the Commons significantly disagreed. The Lords were extremely happy and voted in favour of 100% appointment and 0 people or peers being elected. The Commons, however, voted very much against that position. However, the Commons also voted against every other possible set of proportions that were suggested. The Commons also had that additional amendment, as I mentioned earlier, to abolish the Lords altogether. But again, the ayes 172, the noes 390. So the Lords was there to stay. So what was the impact of all of this discussion and debate and white papers post 2001? There was no consensus in the Commons. So therefore no change resulted. People could not agree. Our MPs could not agree on how to move forward. Felt that there was a need for Lords reform, but how that was going to manifest itself was extremely unclear. Yet another consultation took place in 2003, but that was met with contempt. The general public, arguably, were fairly happy with the Lords' ability to keep the government in check. So arguably, our MPs felt that there was very little need for change. The Constitutional Reform Act 2005 made a few changes that were significant in terms of both the House of Lords and the judiciary. So the Law Lords were removed from the House of Lords and became the first justices in the Supreme Court. This increased the separation of powers, but it did very little overall to the makeup of the House of Lords. We now need to look at 2006, when concerns over the power of the House of Lords really started to hit the public eye, and also the Labour government, who were starting to find the Lords to be a little bit more militant than they would have really liked. 2006, we had the Cash for Honours scandal. Several men who had been nominated for life peerages by Tony Blair turned out that they had in fact lent rather significant sums of money to the Labour Party. The response to that in the media and by the public definitely weakened Blair, probably hastened his demise as Prime Minister, and it did also weaken at the time the public perception of the House of Lords and what they stood for and their role. The Lords also became much more militant. They became more active in debate, amending and blocking legislation. Arguably, this is perhaps due to the significant reduction in the number of in the number of hereditary peers in favour of life peers. Much greater significance of minor parties, third parties, crossbenchers, and also combine that with the Parliament Act 1949. The Lords knew that for the most part it was going to be very difficult to block legislation, but they certainly tried to block legislation where they could, particularly in terms of issues that were perhaps more ethically related or to do with civil rights and liberties. So key pieces of legislation to be aware of here: the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act 2001, and the Lords were not big fans of that at all. The Hunting Act 2004, the government wanted to ban hunting, the Lords said no, and actually the Parliament Act was deployed on that particular occasion. And the Identity Cards Act 2006. At the time, responsibility for Lords reform shifted away from the House of Lords and Lord Falconer to the then leader of the Commons, Jack Straw. So in effect, the Commons trying to reassert a little bit of authority. 2007, another white paper. Clearly, Lords reform is extremely difficult to agree on. So this white paper made a number of recommendations. Elected members and appointed members, nothing new there. Elections every 5 years, with 1/3 of the House replaced for a fixed term of 15 years. So effectively rolling elections, very similar to how elections take place for the Senate in the Congress in the United States. A free vote on the proportion of elected members. So as a reminder, a free vote is a vote in which there is no particular party line or party whip. MPs are free to vote however they feel and not in line with party policy. 20% of members, it was recommended, should be non-party political, so effectively crossbenchers, independent peers. Total House limited to 540 members, and the remaining hereditary peers to be removed via what is quite politely termed as natural wastage. Now, the Commons actually then voted in favour of an all-elected Lords in March 2007. Following that vote, which at the time seemed quite groundbreaking and about to initiate change, Jack Straw, leader of the Commons, announced another cross-party working group to try and work out exactly how this would be implemented, looking at pay, election methods, the number of members and their powers. But surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, no consensus could be agreed. So Gordon Brown, now Prime Minister, announced yet another white paper in May 2008. So from that point, very few changes have been made at all. It is extremely difficult to achieve consensus in any way from parties or between the Commons and the Lords, or indeed even how to even start to go about Lords reform. And that leads to the question, did Blair's Lord reform actually therefore go far enough? You could argue yes, in that nearly all hereditary peers have now gone, and that significantly changed over 800 years of history and tradition in terms of the House of Lords. The Lords has certainly become much more representative of Britain as a whole, and evidence suggests that the Lords really do significantly challenge and scrutinise the Commons and the work of the executive, in particular Blair's government. So arguably the changes that were made did result in the peers in the House of Lords performing a key role much better than they would have done otherwise. The fact that there is also no further consensus or agreement on how to change the laws suggests that yes, Lords reform might well have gone far enough for now. On the other hand, there are still hereditary peers, despite that 1997 manifesto pledge to remove them all. Remember, a government elected has a mandate to achieve the things that are on its winning manifesto, and Labour did not do this. There has been no consensus within the Commons or Parliament as a whole, and issues such as arguably not being particularly democratic because of the lack of election arguably still remain. As with anything in politics though, there is effectively a halfway house. Maybe not 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, but certainly the answer is probably much more subtle than a simple yes or no. The peers are now much more proportionally representative of national voting behaviour. One of the key issues in terms of Commons reform and electoral system reform has been to make the electoral system far more proportional and representative of national voting patterns. At the moment, the first past the post voting system for the Commons does not allow minor parties to perform particularly well. However, maybe that is counteracted by the greater proportional representation within the House of Lords. Lib Dems, independent and crossbench peers now have much more significance. So arguably, the fact that the Lords reforms didn't fully materialise may have actually had positive impact in terms of bringing balance elsewhere and helping to quash down some of the need for further electoral reform of the Commons. Furthermore, changes to the Commons have also increased scrutiny of the executive, so the role of the Lords effectively could be argued to have diminished. Select committees have more resources, their chairs are now paid, so it's a much more desirable role. The Prime Minister must now regularly appear before the liaison committee. So the Lords' role as one of the key scrutineers of the executive has been diminished somewhat, and that has been passed over to people who are elected as MPs in the Commons. So arguably reform does not need to go very much further. So that brings us to the end of this topic video looking at constitutional reform under New Labour, focusing on reform of the Lords. Do check out our other topic videos on other reforms to the Constitution under New Labour, for example, electoral reform and certainly devolution. Thanks for listening. Do check out the website if there's any more information that you need, and we look forward to sharing another video with you sometime soon.